If you're not familiar with Turning Point, we are the local domestic and intimate partner abuse agency in the Lehigh Valley. So we serve Lehigh and Northampton counties, and our mission here in the Lehigh Valley is to eliminate domestic and intimate partner abuse through survivor empowerment, community education, and engagement. So our mission is really at the heart of everything that we do, and that survivor empowerment piece will especially come into play today with our discussion. So when we talk about domestic and intimate partner abuse, what do you think of? What first comes to mind when you think of the words abuse or domestic abuse, intimate partner abuse? Feel free to type in the chat. What do you think of when you think of abuse? Typically, answers that we receive tend to be along the lines of, people tend to think of physical abuse or emotional abuse, gaslighting, or, physical intimidation, that physical level of abuse. But there are so many other forms of abuse that can show up in a dynamic. Thank you. Ruth said controlling behaviors from a partner, which can be verbal, physical, gaslighting, etc. Absolutely. Verbal abuse is another common one that people tend to share. Ashley, slowly stripping away a person's confidence in themselves to quote unquote need their partner. Absolutely. Yeah, so abuse really comes down to any form of power and control. So ultimately with abuse, we tend to see this pattern of coercive behaviors, intentional behaviors by the abuser that are used to gain or maintain power and control over the other person in the relationship. So again, really what it comes down to when you think of the dynamics of abuse, it really comes down to that power and control dynamic. This can be done verbally, it can be done physically, it can be intimidation, it can be done through words, or kind of that emotional manipulation, right? Anything that really allows the abuser, unfortunately, to try to take the power and control over the survivor in the relationship. We also know that it does unfortunately escalate over time. It's not something that typically gets better. It tends to get worse. We also know that it does not discriminate, right? That abuse can affect anyone and everyone. It does not matter your age, your gender, your sexual orientation, your faith belief, your financial status, right? None of that matters. Abuse, unfortunately, can affect anyone and everyone. As such, we at Turning Point serve all survivors. We do not discriminate for any survivors. We also serve survivors of, current abuse, or even if it was a former partner that affected the person. If they need that additional support, we can always connect them with additional services or resources as needed. So we mentioned that abuse can affect anyone and everyone. Really what it comes down to, the statistics tell us that over 1 in 3 women, over 1 in 3 teens, over 1 in 4 men, and over 1 in 3 who identifies LGBTQ+. It's actually over 1 in 2 for trans individuals. But out of these numbers, over 1 in 3, over 1 in 4 will experience physical abuse from an intimate partner at some point in their lives. So I always think about it as, if I'm in a room with 30 people, the odds tell me that there's likely 10 people or more that have experienced physical abuse from an intimate partner at some point. So it's a lot more common, I think, than people tend to realize. Why does abuse occur, right? We mentioned that it really comes down to that power and control dynamic. The abuser seeks to gain or maintain power and control over someone in a relationship over time. So they tend to use a variety of different tactics, as displayed in the power and control wheel on the screen. So this wheel is kind of broken down into 2 separate parts. There's the inner wheel, that light purple that has the different sections. And if you've been to one of our trainings, you may have seen this before. But this really breaks down more of the abusive tactics or behaviors that you will see on a regular basis, right? You'll see things along the lines of sexual harassment or coercion, right? Using those dynamics to coerce or force a survivor into submission. You'll also see things like emotional abuse, right? Name calling, gaslighting, kind of that twisting of words or whatnot. You might see the abuser use technology as a way to control, controlling what they do online, who they talk to on their phone, what they watch on TV or on the internet, who they're friends with, etc. A lot of times you'll also see elements of isolation and exclusion, where the abuser will isolate them from their support system, from their family, from their friends. If the survivor tries to bring up concerns to the abuser, right, they will often respond with one of these responses, right? They will either deny the abuse occurred, I didn't do that. They might blame someone else or blame some other external factor. So, oh, I had a bad day. It was the alcohol. It was, it was because you did X, Y, Z. Or they might minimize it, right? It really wasn't that bad. I'm not sure what you're talking about, right? Those sorts of comments might come back. We might see levels of intimidation, right? Whether that be physical intimidation or, destruction of property, etc. They might use children or others in the close vicinity of the relationship to triangulate the abuse and try to, again, coerce or pressure the survivor into submission. They might use levels of social privilege. So I'm going to ask you, what do you think of when you think of the terms privilege, or how might someone have privilege and use it in a way to control someone else? What forms of privilege might someone have that might control, that they might misuse to control another person? Yeah, absolutely. Financial privilege. And really that could go both ways, right? Where the person we typically think of might have more control of the money, and that could fall under economic abuse as well. But it could also fall along the lines of, I grew up in wealth and you will never understand what this is like. Or the reverse, I grew up in poverty and you will never understand, you will never, you just don't get it, right? And kind of that dismissive tone, that privilege. Job positions, absolutely. Somebody might be in a position or a role that enables them to be a leader or perceived as a leader in the community or perceived as popular in the community. And they might use that as a way to manipulate and coerce the survivor again into saying things like, go ahead and share that I'm abusing you. Nobody's going to believe you, right? That sort of dynamic. What are some other ways that somebody might have privilege and misuse that to control? Sometimes even things like gender could be a way for someone to have privilege. On one end, it could be male privilege. Males are typically perceived as the stronger sex, or that they are, quote unquote, the leaders of the household. So if the male is the abuser, they might misuse that as a way to expect obedience or submission. But female privilege, exists as well, where it could be, along the lines of, hey, go ahead and share with your buddies that I'm abusing you. Nobody's going to believe you because I'm female. Like, people don't tend to think of that as being females as being the abusers. It could even be in queer relationships where, the abuser might be the person defining who is the leader, who makes the decisions, who is more femme, who is more masc, right? Anything along those lines. There might be other layers of privilege, whether it be citizenship status, language privilege, racial privilege, right? So there's so many different dynamics and levels of privilege that someone may use to, unfortunately, try to control the survivor. We also see things like economic abuse or financial abuse, where somebody tries to control the financial decisions or do things behind the other person's back where they don't have that say or consent in regards to finances in the relationship. There might even be things like coercion or threats, where the person might threaten to expose something about the survivor, or even threaten to harm the survivor or harm themselves if the survivor does not comply. So all of these levels of power and control, right, and it's a vast amount of different tactics that could be discussed, but all of these are intended to maintain that layer of power and control. And the outer ring is there as a reinforcer. So forms of physical abuse or sexual abuse, physical violence, sexual violence, may occur in a relationship, they might not occur. But typically they show up when the abuser feels a need to reinforce those layers of power and control that are already happening in the middle of the ring. Another really important piece of the puzzle with abuse is the cycle of abuse, right? So a lot of times we begin the relationship, and the start of the relationship, everything seems great. It's the honeymoon phase, right? They seem like the perfect partner. A lot of time the abusers will gain that control by their charm, right? They might use gifts, be extra complimentary. They might kind of love bomb or create this quick connection in order to charm the survivor into the relationship. Unfortunately, as time progresses, right, tensions will start to build. The abuser will start to use some of those abusive tactics that we just mentioned as a form of sort of psychological warfare to maintain control of the relationship and of the survivor. Usually in this second phase, the survivor feels like they're walking on eggshells, is how they'll describe what this phase feels like. As time goes on, we enter this incident phase where, typically there is some escalation of the control or abusive tactics. So this could be a verbal fit of rage. It could be physical or sexual violence. It could be a digital incident, right? It really doesn't matter. It's just some form of an escalation, again, as a means to kind of maintain that layer of control. Usually during this third phase is when the survivor tries to seek out that support from their support system or connect to resources. Unfortunately, however, after that, there tends to be this fourth and final phase of the reconciliation phase where the abuser will return to the survivor in an effort to reconcile. They may try to apologize for their behavior. They might even flip the script and minimize the abuse, blame the survivor, and ultimately won't necessarily try to take that accountability. But either way, they will re-enter this sort of layer of calm. And unfortunately, the cycle will continue and escalate over time. While it does seem linear in this pattern, it doesn't mean that somebody can't kind of bounce around between the phases, but the pattern is here to understand that unfortunately over time, this is kind of that cycle that we tend to see. So if you do have any questions throughout, please feel free to type in the chat. Hopefully for some of you, this is review. But as we go through, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer throughout. So that's kind of just a little bit of background, but really we're here, right, to talk about trauma and understanding and how to support survivors who might be experiencing that additional layer of trauma. Again, when we talk about abuse, it really comes down to that power and control dynamic. So keeping that in mind when we talk about trauma is super important. So just a basic understanding, trauma really comes down to some sort of event that has occurred in the person's life, whether it be a physical event or an emotional event. But really that event has created these challenging emotional consequences and is a distressing event in that moment. There is typically an immediate response from the body, from the mental, emotional effects of the person. But there is also often a long-term effects that are impacted, especially as the distressing event often feels either physically life-threatening or can be emotionally very disturbing. So that can impact the person, and it becomes this thing that continues to affect them over time. If you consider something like, a survivor of sexual assault, for example, If it is a one-time thing, it is just one event that they're responding to. But in survivors of abuse, unfortunately, because it is this consistent pattern of abusive behaviors and abusive tactics, unfortunately, it is that long-term trauma where they're not just responding to one distressing event. Their body and mind and emotions are essentially reacting to multiple distressing events over time. So it can be this kind of compounding impact where they're not just dealing with the long-term effects of one event, but multiple events that have happened over the course of the relationship. So if we think about the different layers of trauma that somebody might experience, there's a lot of different forms here. Really, the point of this is just to understand that if we think of trauma as an onion, right, we have to remember that at the center of that onion is still a human. It's still the survivor, right? That they are not just what they've experienced, but they're still that human with their own goals, needs, interests at the center of it. That being said, there is also these additional layers that have impacted them, right? So it could be developmental trauma, things that happened in their childhood that are continuing to affect them. Physical, sexual, emotional abuse, assault, abandonment, right? We talk about things like the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. That's a really good understanding of those developmental traumas. There could be vicarious trauma, right? Where we've listened to somebody else's trauma and it feels like we're experiencing it firsthand. Therapists often, or people in these sort of social services, deal with vicarious trauma a lot. Acute trauma could be from one disturbing event, incident, a natural disaster, an accident of some sort. Complex trauma really is what a lot of times we're seeing in these cases, where we're not just dealing with one particular incident, but it is this compounding effect of multiple different events that affect the person. PTSD, a lot of people are very familiar with, but it is that, that trauma symptoms that continue and persist after the event for a very prolonged period of time that can kind of make the person feel like they are reliving that trauma. And then we have all of these other additional traumas that may impact the person, right? So historical trauma, traumas that may have been inflicted on groups because of their creed, because of their race, their community, that continues to affect their descendants over time. We might have intergenerational trauma. So, for example, a child that maybe was raised in an abusive home is now dealing with their own experiences of intimate partner abuse with their own partner, right? Having that over time experience of, they may have lived with the trauma firsthand, but now they're also experiencing it for themselves. Systems-induced trauma, right? So maybe traumatic removal from a home, separation from their siblings, traumatic experiences in foster care, right? Those multiple changes due to systems that are in place, obviously, possibly to protect, but that could create that additional layer of trauma or difficulty for the individual. And then we have things like grief-induced trauma, right? A sudden death of a parent, or a sibling or a caretaker. That could lead to that traumatic grief. Even medical trauma, sometimes serious disease, illness, pain, injury, medical procedures, frightening treatments, especially, again, in the context of abuse, where if there's layers of physical abuse or whatnot that the person may have to deal with, traumatic brain injury, perhaps, they may have this additional layer of all of these things to deal with. But again, remembering that at the center of all of these forms of trauma is still the human, and is still the person with their own needs, wants, desires. So if we talk about what does trauma look, sound, or feel like, right? It can show up in so many different ways. And I'm sure that you've probably, experienced some of these on your own, because we all go through different layers of trauma, right? We all have experienced various layers of difficulty, of events that may have impacted us in some way, right? But again, that element of trauma over time may show up in things like decreased concentration, right? The survivor might numb or disassociate. They might go through emotional overwhelm. They might feel hopeless. They might have little to no memory of what happened or struggle to piece together what happened because as a protective mechanism, right, their brain is trying to support and separate those items. There's a really good YouTube video called The World's Messiest Desk that kind of explains what this is like, especially for a survivor of abuse. But the idea is that if I asked you to write, a chapter of your biography, of your life, on whatever scrap pieces of paper I could find, sticky notes, random scraps of paper around my desk, and then I scatter them throughout the office, and I say, hey, go ahead and piece this together, right? Oftentimes that is what it is, asking a survivor to retell what their abuse is like, trying to piece together little moments here and there from one sticky note, might be hidden under here, might be grabbed under there, right? But you're trying to not only collect all of that information and bring it back, but piece it together in a linear fashion. So a lot of times, one big piece of being trauma-informed or trauma-responsive is recognizing that the stories from abusers might seem very disjointed and not linear, but that's just because that's what trauma does, right? It affects the brain's ability to create that linear pattern. It's not that the stories are incorrect or untrue. It's just that that's how they are able to access it and connect the information. So, if you may suspect that someone is going through abuse, right? We use this thing called the pair trauma tool. Number one, we want to make sure that, and this is just a screening tool. A lot of it is kind of common sense, but number one, we want to make sure that we're providing privacy to discuss those sensitive topics, not just privacy, out of earshot, but ideally behind closed doors, possibly, or just in a way that is completely out of earshot of other people. So not just behind a curtain, for example. But, sometimes in these moments, a companion of the person, especially in a medical facility, might refuse to be separated from the survivor. Again, this could be an indicator of abuse, neglect, violence. Right? So providing that level of privacy or possibly being creative with it as a way to initiate that conversation is super important. Because if I am the survivor and my abusive partner is continually telling me, nobody's going to believe you, that, if you leave, I will harm you, X, Y, Z, right? There's all of these threats and fears at play. I might not trust anyone to be able to share. So we want to be able to build that trust and provide that private space. Sometimes the simplest way to share information is in a way that is non-judgmental and normalizes information sharing, right? So educating, hey, I educate all of my patients about this topic because, hey, violence is really common. It has a big impact on our health, on our safety, on our well-being. Here's where our resources are if you ever need them or if you ever want to talk. Sometimes even creating, like a nonverbal way to express those things might be easier. A lot of times, especially in the medical field, the question is, do you feel safe at home? And it's very easy to just say yes or no. But if somebody's asking me and I'm, feeling kind of defensive, I don't know if I can trust you, I'm probably going to say no, even if I am experiencing violence at home. So thinking about how we ask those questions as well, or how we bring up that topic, education is a really good non-judgmental way to do that. If we choose to ask, like, hey, is there anything else you'd like to share? Would you like some information? How are you feeling? Right? Make sure that you're also allowing that time for discussion. We don't want someone to feel rushed or as though they are not important, especially in those moments, because you might be the one person that they are choosing to speak to. If someone says, hey, I'm good, nothing's going on, I'm fine, I don't want to talk about it, okay. You know what? We have to respect that. They might not be ready. They might not even recognize it as abuse. right? We have to understand that, again, if abuse comes down to power and control, if we try to step in and make those choices for the survivor, we are doing exactly the same thing that the abuser has been doing. We are taking away that power and control and that choice from them. So we want to respect whatever their choice is. If they do choose to disclose, respond, right? Make sure that you are providing resources. Make sure that you are offering that supportive just ear sometimes, just so that they know that they're not isolated, they're not alone. Or arrange for an introduction, right? Make that warm handoff to a resource such as Turning Point or other resources that may be available. Last but not least, right? It's not just about being trauma informed and recognizing that, hey, survivors might be going through this complex layer of trauma, but also being trauma responsive, right? Thinking about how can we actively apply that knowledge and be sensitive to their needs. How can we make sure that they are a part of this decision-making process? So, number one, asking them, what makes you feel safe? Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe, psychologically safe. Do you feel safe in this screening? Do you feel safe in our office, right? And talking about it, what doesn't make you feel safe? How can we fix that? How can we rectify and make you feel safer to do your job, to do what you need to do? Making sure that all decisions are also made with transparency, because again, if the abuser is continuing to make decisions without the person's consent or coercing them into decisions, we want to make sure that we're being transparent about all decisions, all processes, to not only build trust, but maintain that trust over time, right? We want to integrate them into the organization, into the process, as much as possible, and being consistent with that, consistent and transparent. We also want to make sure that, there might be power differences between staff and clients or between organizational staff. We want to make sure that we are leveling those power differences as much as possible, right? That we are providing that empowerment-based discussion. We're not deciding for them or taking that power and control away from them, but we are all here to kind of support one another in just different ways, right? That I might have a different role, but that doesn't mean that I have any more power than the individual that I'm trying to serve or work with. We also want to validate, right, the person's strengths, and ideally also recognize that, hey, I might have my own biases and stereotypes based on race, ethnicity, geography, sexual orientation, age, right? Recognizing that my responsiveness might be a little biased, and understanding and being willing to be curious and ask those questions like, hey, does this mean this for you? Or what does that mean for you? How would this be best for you, right? Because everyone's different. I'm Greek, doesn't mean that I'm the same as every other Greek person that's out here. So asking those questions, being transparent, providing that space for consent in all elements of service is huge when it comes to trauma-informed care. Last but not least, you may be familiar with our services, but we have our 24/7 helpline, which is really the entrance point into all of our services. If you ever need us, if you know someone who does, please encourage them to call our helpline. You can always initiate a call if you are working with a patient, with a client. We will ask to speak to the survivor directly for specific advice, but you can always call as a support system or as, needing that additional resource, like, hey, what resources do you have available? Do you have any resources for this particular topic that I can maybe share with the person that I'm working with? And that is an option as well. But really, our 24/7 helpline is the access point for all of our services. All services that we offer are not only confidential, but they're offered at no cost. So we don't go through insurance, anything like that. We have our empowerment counselors who are not traditional therapists, but they're available to help support and guide the survivors through the things that they're experiencing. We do offer counseling for children and teens, as well as adults all the way up. We also have support groups. We do ask that people attend an individual session prior to joining a support group, but that is an option as well. We also have legal advocates who are available in both courthouses, and they are able to support and guide survivors who might be seeking a protection from abuse order or a PFA order. While they can't give out legal advice, they are able to make referrals for legal resources, and again, can just be that guide through the process, because the legal process can be very complex and daunting. So just having that supportive guide through can be really helpful. We also have our housing program. So through that, we have our emergency safe house program for any survivors who might be fleeing abuse in immediate danger and need to get out. They don't have anywhere else to go. We do also, however, have transitional housing advocates that can help survivors complete the housing assessments and help connect them with long-term housing need resources. We have our training and education team, which consists of child and teen awareness, education, and prevention, as well as adult and community training and education. We also do medical advocacy to provide those resources for healthcare professionals to ensure that, when survivors might be speaking to somebody and you might be their first point of contact, ensuring that you have those resources to connect survivors as needed. And last but not least, I apologize, I know we're a little over time, but last but not least, if you wanted to take a picture of this, these are just some additional resources. So we have our 24/7 helpline and all of our social media handles, as well as our website. But we also have the national hotline, which can be found at thehotline.org. If you are not from this area, or if you need an additional resource for another area outside of these two counties, Lehigh and Northampton County, the national hotline has a lot of really great resources, as well as a search network for other local DV agencies in the United States and Canada, I believe. And then there's also a really great resource called the loveisrespect.org. And through that, they offer a teen dating abuse text line. So for teens that might feel more comfortable texting someone, they can text and contact an advocate through that helpline. But super grateful for you being here. I hope it was beneficial. You will have if you do have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat. I'll hang out for a little bit. But I will say that there will be a survey that should pop up when you exit the window for today. If you wouldn't mind providing us with any feedback or support or questions that you might have, I'd be happy to connect with you that way. I will also put my email address in the chat. So if you have any questions, either, about today's topic or just, questions that don't require an immediate response, please feel free to email me if needed. Or again, if you have any other questions, you can always call our helpline. You don't need to be in crisis to call the helpline for support. We're really there, to answer any questions, help support as we can. So thank you. I'm gonna stop recording.